That's right. Yes,
Okay,
I
great.
am.
We're gonna start in a couple of seconds. Let's see how many participants we have. Okay. Welcome everyone. Let me turn on. Welcome everyone. Today at the Islamic College, we have an online session, which is entitled, "What is Islamic about Islamic Art?" Our presenter today is Professor Stephennie Mulder, who is an associate professor of Islamic art and architecture at the University of Texas at Austin. She's a specialist in Islamic art, architectural history, and archaeology. She worked for over 10 years as the head of ceramicists at Balis, a medieval Islamic city in Syria, and has conducted archaeological and art historical fieldwork in Syria, Egypt, Turkey, and elsewhere in the region. Professor Mulder's book, "The Shrines of Alids in Medieval Syria, Sunnis, Shias, and Architecture of Coexistence," which was published in 2014, received numerous awards. She has published on matters related to heritage preservation and the trade in looted antiquities, Islamic archaeology, and cultural heritage in the Journal of Islamic Archaeology, the International Journal of Islamic Architecture, and the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Archaeology. She has appeared in media interviews and written editorials for media outlets such as Time, the BBC, IB Times, Al Jazeera, the LA Times, and the US News and World Report on cultural heritage issues, Islamic art, antiquities, and the history of sectarian relations in Islam. Without further ado, we're going to ask Professor Mulder to start her presentation. May I ask all the participants to kindly mute their microphone so that there won't be any disruption, as this is being recorded, and we will probably put it on YouTube, not probably, but definitely put it on YouTube later. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Professor Mulder. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction and for the invitation to present in this wonderful forum. It's really an honor to be here, sort of symbolically or imaginatively, even though I'm here in Texas. To imagine myself in London is really a delight. Of course, it's a city that I love a lot and such a cosmopolitan international city, and one that I hope to return to at some point in the near future. So thank you so much for the invitation, and especially thank you to Ali Peya for reaching out to invite me to this forum. I'm going to present to you today kind of an argument that summarizes some recent scholarship within the field of Islamic art that aims to confront some really, let's say, challenging but also really deeply interesting questions revolving around the question, of my presentation, which is simply, what is, quote, Islamic about Islamic art? And while this may seem like, here we go. Always nice to see something to look at. This may seem like at first a pretty straightforward question. I hope I will convince you by the end of the presentation that it's actually a really complicated question, but one that's complicated in really interesting ways that make it, for me at least, an endlessly fascinating source of new intellectual endeavor and interest. So I come to you this evening, perhaps fittingly just a little over a week after Eid al-Adha, and to belatedly wish you an Eid Mubarak. I'm going to come today to tell you not necessarily kind of a tale of direct evolution of art over time. I'm not going to tell you the ways that art can necessarily illuminate history, although as an art historian, I certainly think that it can. Instead, today, what I'd like to think about or ponder together with all of you, and I'll be glad to hear your thoughts and take your questions at the end of my presentation. One of the most apparently enduring questions in my field, namely, what actually is Islamic art? And in fact, is the term Islamic even the term that we should be using? Now, if you're here this evening, it's likely that you already believe you have something of an idea about the answer to this question. But it turns out this question is far more complicated and thus, as I said a moment ago, far more interesting and intriguing than it seems at first blush. So this evening, I'd like to explore why I think this problem of what exactly Islamic art is remains so enduring and so perplexing, and also talk a little bit about how this problem is also the very reason I think the field will remain so endlessly rich and fascinating now and in the present. I'd like to do this by walking you through both a bit of history of the Islamic world, which certainly will be familiar to many of you in this very learned audience, and also through the history of the field of art history and the way that it has thought about Islamic art. And I'm going to really kind of push back against some of the typical assumptions about what Islamic art is, which arise out of a European episteme or a European system of knowledge about what art is. And in many ways, Islamic art really challenges all of those assumptions about really what art is in the European tradition, but in ways that give us incredibly fruitful avenues of exploration. Because one of the most interesting things about this question of what Islamic art or what's Islamic about Islamic art is that it forces us to ask questions about the broader history of art. And so our answer to the question of what's Islamic about Islamic art allows us also to realign how we think not only about what Islamic art is, but actually what art is and why we have decided it's one kind of thing and not another. So let's begin by asking a simple question. What is Islamic art, and why have I put Islamic in quotations in the title of my presentation? It's probably best to start by talking about what we think we're talking about when we say Islamic art. So I'd like to start with a little bit of history to get us all oriented and on the same page. And from there, I'll move toward thinking more deeply about how that very history allows us to think very deep and searching questions about the nature of this form of artistic production. So let's begin where it seems logically to begin, and then I'll explain why the beginning is only one kind of way to understand Islamic art. As many of you know, Islam was founded in 622 AD in Arabia, when a young man named Muhammad began to receive revelations from God, which eventually would be collected to form a new holy book, the Quran. The basic teachings of this book are, of course, very similar to those of the Torah and of the Bible. It contains many of the same stories. Muslims revere the same prophets, of course, including Jesus. The teachings of the Quran revolve around the duties of Muslims in the worship of God, the afterlife, which awaits the believers, and the elaboration of God's laws, which were designed to ensure universal justice in human society. By far, the most important Islamic principle is the unity of God, a kind of pure monotheism. Unlike in Christianity, where God's essence was believed to be expressed through the Trinity of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Muslims believe God is one, and there is only one God. The Quran also laid out the 5 ritual duties of a Muslim, sometimes called, for shorthand, the 5 pillars: belief in the unity of God, prayer, fasting, the giving of alms or donations to the poor, and going on Hajj or pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in one's life, if possible. But from the beginning, Islam was much more than just a spiritual practice. It was envisioned as a kind of template for a perfect society, and this meant that it had to be both a religious and a political system, and that its leaders were simultaneously religious and political figures, not an uncommon arrangement in the 7th century AD. In this, Islam was born in the period of what we now call late antiquity, the period following the 4th century AD transformation of the Roman Empire to Christianity. And it was not that appreciably different than any other late antique system. The Eastern Roman or Byzantine emperor, for example, was also head of the church. And the late antique world was, of course, an age of empires. And in late antiquity, if one wanted to have a polity or a political system, one needed to have an empire. The 7th century world that Islam appeared in was divided up between two massive and warring empires. We sometimes call them the two superpowers of late antiquity, that of the late Roman or Byzantine Empire, which covered the area of the Mediterranean and which was, as I said a moment ago, the Christian descendant of the Roman Empire, and that of the Sasanians, who ruled the area of the modern Middle East and the Persianate world, and who were descendants of ancient Iranian dynasties, the Parthians and the Achaemenids. Yet remarkably, when these early Muslims from this tiny town in Arabia began to try to establish an empire, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Within 50 years, they had conquered more territory than the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, and it's worth noting, had done so in a quarter of the time it took the Roman Empire to expand, had entirely eliminated the Persian Sasanian dynasty, and had severely pushed back the borders of the Byzantine or late Roman Empire, which would continue to contract until it was finally conquered by the Ottomans in the 16th century. Sorry, in the 15th century. By 750, Islam stretches from Spain to the borders of India and China, a fact that still marks the Islamic conquest as one of the most rapid military expansions in human history. Surely it must have seemed to these early Muslims, and indeed also to many non-Muslim observers at the time who wrote about the Islamic conquest with awe, that God had willed their victory. And this society they created was, the society they created, and this, sorry, Entisar, could you mute your, hello, I think we have someone who needs to mute. There we go. Yet remarkably, when the, where was I? And the society they created was intellectually and culturally one of the most sophisticated and complex the world has ever known. In the beginning, the notable cultural and artistic centers were found in the Arab world in cities like Damascus in Syria, Cordoba in Spain, and Baghdad in Iraq. In later centuries, after successive groups of Turkic and Mongol peoples moved into the central Islamic lands and merged with Arab and Persian cultural milieus, cities like Isfahan, Bukhara, Samarkand, Delhi, and Istanbul rise to prominence, even as new cities in the Arab world appeared as well. In all of them, there were great achievements in scholarship and science, poetry and prose, the arts of the book, and architecture. To take just a couple of examples of this moment of cultural efflorescence, as early as the 8th century, the Muslim caliph or ruler, who ruled from Baghdad, became a patron of learning and founded an academy called the House of Wisdom, or the Dar al-Hikmah in Arabic, whose ancient philosophical and scientific works were gathered from all corners of the known world and translated by a diverse group of Muslims, Christians, and Jews who worked together. In addition to the House of Wisdom, the Caliph al-Ma'mun set up observatories in which astronomers could chart the stars, and a bit later, Muslim rulers built hospitals where doctors practiced some of the most advanced medicine of the day. In fact, much of what we know today about ancient Greek science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy was translated, transformed, and further developed in these late antique and medieval institutions, and only later translated from Arabic into Latin into medieval Europe. What this means is that the European Renaissance was not as unique or isolated an event as we often assume. Indeed, it may well have never happened, or at least not in quite the same way, if not for this earlier influx of Greek and Arabic intellectual works from the Islamic world. This emphasis on the acquisition of knowledge and learning meant that medieval Islamic cities were some of the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan of the pre-modern world, as merchants and scholars traveled across the now contiguous expanse of the Islamic world, which stretched from one end of the known earth to the other in one great interconnected expanse. Cities like Cairo, for example, in the early 14th century, at a time when Paris comprised a few thousand souls, had nearly 500,000 people, an astonishingly massive city in medieval terms. And in the 1320s, when the medieval traveler Ibn Battuta traveled through and penned these lines of poetry, it was arguably the greatest city of Africa, Europe, and Southwest Asia. Cairo's Al-Azhar University was the principal seat of Islamic learning and one of the world's earliest university-like institutions of learning. It had broad streets and magnificent buildings, and Cairo's avenues coursed with crowds of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, as well as Asians, Sub-Saharan Africans, Venetians, and other Europeans. Now, hopefully I've set the stage a bit, giving you a small window into the rich cosmopolitan world of medieval and early modern Islam, the world that produced the art that I will explore today, this evening. Let's now turn back to my question of what's Islamic about Islamic art. And I'd like to do this by laying out a few premises. The first is that despite the long history of seeing European and the Islamic world in oppositional terms,
You didn't even
Islamic
have a pencil, Hasnan. You didn't. مع السلامة.
Hello, would you mind just muting if you just joined us? Thank you. Now, hopefully I've set the stage just a bit, giving you a small window into the rich cosmopolitan world of medieval and early modern Islam, the world that produced the art that I will explore today. Let's turn now back to my question of what's Islamic about Islamic art. And I'd like to do this by laying out a few premises. The first is that despite the long history of seeing the European and Islamic world in oppositional terms, Islamic art is in fact European art, and European art is Islamic. I can say this for two straightforward reasons. First of all, in terms of simple geometry, Muslims in fact ruled European territories for centuries, indeed for over 1,000 years, if you add up the 800 years of Muslim rule in Spain and Sicily, and the nearly 500 years of Ottoman presence in Eastern Europe. So just in terms of simple geography, Islam has always been part of the story of Europe, a reality that continues unbroken into the present. Yet how many of us know that, for example, there was a mosque inside the Parthenon? Or that there would be no Gothic art without the ribbed vaulting systems and pointed arches of Islamic architecture, which were present in Spain from at least the 10th century. While there were, of course, periods of conflict between medieval and early modern Muslim Europeans and Christian Europeans, and struggles over land and territory, there were also long periods of coexistence and pragmatic strategic compromise, arguably, in fact, more of the latter than of the former. Indeed, over the 800 years of Muslim presence in Spain, medieval Christian kingdoms were as likely to make treaties with their Muslim neighbors as they were to attempt to conquer them. In truth, the Pope had to spend several centuries convincing the Christian kings that conquest was even a good idea at all. So we could say that the so-called Christian Reconquista was more of a reluctantista. But the second related point I just alluded to is also interesting, and that is that from the perspective of artistic production, Islamic art is in every way, shape, and form the great sister tradition of European art, not only because of this geographical proximity, but because Islamic art develops in tandem with, sometimes profoundly influencing and sometimes profoundly influenced by, European art. And for this reason, perhaps more than any other artistic tradition, it deserves to be studied in these terms. I say this for a simple reason. Much like European art, Islamic art develops out of the same late antique roots in ancient Mesopotamia and the ancient Mediterranean world, and it represents the visual culture of a civilization that shares with Christian Europe many of the same values, religious history, and political and economic relationships. In short, Islamic art and European art are two branches of the same tree with the same roots, roots planted deep in the soil of the late antique world. What's interesting is not only the relation between them, but how within the field of art history, we tell the story as one of difference, not of parallel developments. Everyone knows Islamic art is deeply invested in ornamented surfaces and abstraction, for example. But how often do we consider that one of Islamic art's primary progenitors, Roman art, was also deeply interested in ornament and abstraction? Who would ever study the ornamented vegetal panels of the famous first century Ara Pacis, or Altar of Augustan Peace in Rome, although those ornamental panels cover at least as much space as the figural ornament, and maybe more, as you can see in this image. But we're taught not to see them, or to see them as framing subsidiaries of the more significant figural procession above. It's not that this is wrong. Of course, figural ornaments are extremely important in Roman art, but the emphasis only on the upper half and not the lower half feeds a certain narrative about European art as primarily figural, and by extension, Islamic art as primarily ornamental. The real story is in fact far richer and far more complex. More on that in just a moment. Yet Islamic art was also very much unlike European art because it was from the outset global. Given Europe's dominance on the world stage for the past 300 to 500 years, it's easy to forget how very provincial Europe was at the center of global affairs for well over 1,000 years. This map, which represents the Islamic world in the early modern period in the around 1700, just at the moment of the rise of European powers as a global phenomenon on the world stage, but before that balance has entirely tipped. I often tell my students this is Professor Mulder's favorite map, because unlike the more commonly used Mercator map, it accurately represents the curvature of the sphere that is our Earth, and thus avoids the distorting features of the Mercator map, which makes objects closer to the poles seem nearly 3 times their actual size. The Mercator map places Europe at the center and makes it seem as though it's larger than it actually is, when in fact, all of Europe could easily fit inside the medieval West African kingdom of King Mansa Musa, or the early modern empire of Mughal India. In fact, I wish I had a copy of this map to pull out every time someone asks me, as they all too frequently do, so how did you become interested in this seemingly obscure topic of Islamic art? Because really my reply is always, how could you not be interested in the art of the world's second largest religion, the art of a series of stupendously wealthy and influential empires that sat at the center of the earth, stretching across 3 vast continents for over 1,000 years, that shaped and molded the art of Europe, Africa, and Asia, the art of a religion and a cultural phenomenon that was and still is profoundly influential in global affairs. You can say a lot of things about Islamic art, but it's difficult to convincingly argue that it is marginal. Yet you wouldn't know that from opening an art history textbook, where Islamic art is still treated as a side attraction to the dominant story of the rise of European art. So now that I have, I hope, convinced you that Islamic art is something we should all be interested in, what about this term Islamic? And why have I put it in quotations? This term, it turns out, is something of a misnomer, or at least a term that needs some qualifications, a semester's worth of them if you're my student. Because the term Islamic implies that what we're looking at when we study Islamic art is the art of Islam, the art of a religious tradition and the art of a place in the world that is still somehow devoted to a religion, even in our ostensible age of secularism. That Islamic art is a term akin to, let's say, Christian art, Buddhist art, or Hindu art. Now, while much of the art we study in the field of Islamic art is indeed religious art, the vast majority of it occupies a realm that's more difficult and interesting to define. In fact, much of the art that we study as, quote, Islamic is the product of the everyday production of the everyday princely production that would fall under an umbrella that today we'd call secular, in that it doesn't appear to have explicitly religious content. Here, for example, is a sensual image of 2 lovers who have just drunk a bottle of wine, portrayed as 2 bodies merged into one at the very moment of seduction. It would seem at first blush that there is little in the content of this image that speaks directly to the faith of Islam. Yet we still call it Islamic art. Why? One answer is that we don't actually have a better term that encompasses all of the ethnic, religious, and geographical complexity of the pre-modern Islamic world. We could call this painting Persian or Iranian art, and it wouldn't be entirely wrong, since it was made in what today comprises the geographical area of the modern nation-state of Iran. Yet, when the image was made, that nation-state did not yet exist, though a strong sense of Iranian identity certainly did, and it has been revived again and again. But at the same time, the Safavid Empire that produced this image was in fact founded by Shah Ismail, who was the great-great-grandson of the Christian emperors Alexius IV of Trebizond and King Alexander I of Georgia. How is that, you might ask? Well, Shah Ismail's mother is Martha, better known as Halima Begum. She was the daughter of Uzun Hasan, the ruler of the Turkmen Akkoyunlu dynasty, and her mother was a Pontic Greek woman named Theodora Megale Komnene, later known as Despina Khatun. In short, the Safavid Empire, which is often credited with a revival of Persian national identity, was of Turkish, Persian, and Kurdish origin. And in fact, Shah Ismail's pedigree was far from unusual. The Safavid Empire, like every Islamic empire that had come before it, was far from ethnically unified, and its populations and even its rulers comprised people of a variety of mixed heritages and backgrounds from all over the vast geographical expanse of this immense crossroads of civilizations. One really cannot speak of the art produced in this region in a way that fits in today's national categories as Turkish or Syrian or Iranian in pre-modern times, because these terms would not have been recognized as meaningful. How then to call a form of art that crosses over all of our modern ethnic and national boundaries? Given that the one thing that all of the empires that ruled the Middle East had in common was that they were ruled by Muslim rulers, Islamic then seems like as useful a term as any. But this term is also imperfect for the reason I've already alluded to above. Many of the works of art, indeed many of those who actually created the works of art we call Islamic, may not even themselves have been Muslim, and many works of art that seem to have little to do with Islam as a religion. So let's explore this a little bit more deeply, in particular, the question of whether the term Islamic is akin to Christian or Buddhist as a marker of primarily religious content. It turns out that this is a very complicated problem to approach, because much of what we call today Islamic art might have been made by non-Muslims who comprised a majority in Islamic lands, at least up until about the 11th or 12th century, until major conversion episodes begin to be prominent. And even after there is a majority of Muslims in these regions, Christians, Jews, and others remain a significant and influential minority, often including having places of honor within various Islamic rulers' courtly apparatus. Such is certainly the case with works like this one, the Great Canteen in the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C., produced in the 13th century in Syria in Islamic style, but bearing Christian imagery. All of this is further complicated by the fact that much of Islamic art appears on the surface to be explicitly contradictory to the official tenets of Islam as a religion. Take, for example, this inlaid medieval wine cup made in Herat in modern Afghanistan in the 15th century. Its bulbous body and cylindrical narrow neck are made of brass inlaid with gold and silver in a technique that was pioneered in Kurdish and Arab lands further to the west, in what is today Mosul in Iraq. On its surface is an inscription that says, "To Allah belongs the might, power, victory, and strength." We can also see direct parallels all over the Islamic world. For example, this one, which is here in a local collection in Houston. And it's a strange thing to contemplate an object of our art that both praises Allah and that is at the same time meant to drink wine that is ostensibly to be avoided in Islam. And in fact, this wine cup is not a one-off. Despite the advice to avoid the consumption of alcohol that's clearly laid out in the Quran, and the later support of such prohibitions by legal scholars, wine drinking was in fact widespread in the Islamic world, so much so that the image of a seated figure holding a cup is in fact the standardized image of the Islamic rulers from Spain to India. This association between wine and kingship was so strong that even the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan commissioned a jade wine cup that he probably never drank wine from because he himself piously avoided the consumption of alcohol. And yet the symbol of the wine cup remained strong. And in the belief that losing one's senses could bring one closer to God, wine drinking became an integral part of Sufi mystical practices. In some traditions, we've got the miniature paintings to prove it. We might make a similar argument for the so-called prohibition on figural ornament in Islamic art. In fact, particularly when we consider the long tradition of manuscript illustration, but also of figurative ceramics, metalware, woodwork, and any range of other possibilities, Islamic art is arguably as full of figures as any other artistic tradition. And that included representations of holy figures, which also proliferate in Islamic art. In the case of figural imagery, what does hold true is that it was, of course, avoided in religious spaces and on religious objects. So, for example, there would never be a mosque with figural imagery on the walls, but you would find images of the prophets inside books of Islamic history or poetry. Islamic art, in fact, Islam itself, it would seem, is not so easy to pin down or put into simple boxes. Indeed, between the legalist piety of today's Salafi revivalists and the wine-drinking abandon of medieval Sufi practitioners is a vast, complex, and rich world that I prefer to call Islam's, with an S at the end, as an indication of the richness of this pluralistic tradition. So, how to manage all of this contradiction? A geographical expanse that stretches across Europe, Africa, and Asia, including under its umbrella 3 continents, countless ethnic groups, people, national identities, an enormous range of faiths, only unified under a Muslim ruler. Perhaps it's simplest just to call it Islamic, but to begin to study what is Islamic in all of its vast tapestry of complexity and diversity. The writer Shahab Ahmed, in his monumental 600-page tome, What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic, published 9 years ago in 2015, argued that in fact to be Islamic was to embrace all of this contradiction and to in fact think of the contradiction and complexity of Islamic history itself as the defining feature of what it means to be Islamic. Ahmed argued that the essential characteristics of Islamic civilization were not to be found in the 5 pillars of ritual practice, in other words, in prayer, fasting, hajj, and zakat, nor in the strict rulings of legal scholars, although these are all certainly very important. He argued that while we should certainly consider all of these more conventional markers of what it means to be Islamic, at the same time, we have to consider the lived practice of Muslims over time and the complex and contradictory discourses they engaged in and continue to engage in about what it means to be Islamic. For Ahmed, Islam cannot be reduced merely to the surahs of the Quran or a group of legal rulings by scholars, but a great ongoing contradictory discourse and a lived practice that included both prohibitions on wine drinking and figural images alongside the simultaneous creation of them, that included prohibitions on the visitation of shrines and tombs of saintly people, and at the same time the lived practice shared across the Islamic world of visiting shrines and tombs of saintly people. In other words, the only way to contain and comprise all of this complexity and contradiction is to simply admit its existence and to begin to grapple honestly with all of the dense, rich threads that make up this multicolored tapestry we call Islamic. So let's pause for a minute and see if we can see where we are. Hopefully by now I've given you a brief glimpse into why the term Islamic is itself so complex and at the same time so endlessly interesting, and why even if in a lifetime of study, one cannot begin to hope to understand it all. It certainly won't do to stop here in the middle of all this contradiction. So perhaps I can leave you with a few broad characterizations that can help you understand what you are looking at when you walk through the Islamic galleries so expertly curated by, for example, some of my colleagues at the British Museum there in London. So first, let's summarize what I've laid out so far. 3 premises, I think, that capture the essence of the argument. 1, the medieval Islamic world was a region under the political control of Islamic empires, but one that was also shaped by diverse inhabitants of many faiths and ethnicities. They too are part of the story of Islamic art. 2, Islamic art is a term that may refer to a religion, but the religion itself was expansive and often contradictory. Islamic may also refer to the complex civilization created under the political control of Muslim rulers. 3, medieval Islamic civilization was global. the cultural, scientific, and intellectual influence of the medieval Middle East extends far beyond the modern geographical boundaries of the region. So I'd like to leave you today with what I call the essentials of Islamic art. You'll see that they are quite general and they're not meant to be prescriptive, but they're broad enough that they enable us to see some through lines in all of this complexity. First, Islamic world is, oops, I forgot that I had this slide. Yes, okay, so this kind of summarizes my three premises. The idea that the Islamic world was under the political control of Islamic empires, but shaped by diverse inhabitants of many faiths and ethnicities. Also, the idea that Islamic may refer to a religion or to kind of the political sort of complexity of the civilizations over which was controlled by Muslim rulers. And the third, the idea that Islamic civilization was global and that global character truly shapes what Islamic art looks at, and that influence extended really beyond the modern geographical boundaries of the religion. So let's look at what I call, quote unquote, the essentials of Islamic art. First, it's a descendant of the visual traditions of ancient and late antique Roman and Sasanian art. So let's just take a little look at what this looks like. We can think, for example, about the Dome of the Rock and the way in which the Dome of the Rock was built out of these prior traditions of Roman funerary culture and commemorative culture. Yet Islamic art takes the Dome of the Rock and transforms it into something else entirely. But we also see that in the earliest mosque forms. So the second of my premises is the idea that the mosque itself has its origins in various types of domestic architecture. In other words, in the home of the Prophet Muhammad, who was probably, we don't know for sure what this house looks like, of course, because by now it's been built over so many times in Medina to become the holy mosque of the Prophet there. But the early textual descriptions describe it as a simple courtyard with a covered area. And in fact, that's precisely what many mosques look like up into the present. So the mosque, in other words, is a monumentalization of various house forms. And for that reason, it's a very pragmatic type of architecture. If you have a simple courtyard with a covered area behind it, it's very easy to see how you can expand that endlessly as the population of Muslims in any given city grows. The most obvious example of this is the Mosque of Cordoba, which over its long evolution over many centuries simply had another row of columns and another row of columns and another row of columns added on to account for the expansion of space. So this kind of pragmatic quality of the mosque is a very important feature of Islamic art. Another is that abstraction is a key value. So what is abstraction? Well, it became, of course, a major preoccupation of art history in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. But Islamic art was always deeply interested in in abstraction. And what this means is that Islamic art wasn't particularly concerned with simply replicating what the eye sees with a kind of photorealistic, sort of, illusionistic representation of what you can see. Rather, the idea was to portray the meaning and essence of things by perhaps distorting forms, transforming forms in a way that they better capture the feeling or idea of something. And that interest in abstraction is something that has always been present in Islamic art and also is the heritage of the late antique world, one that connects it back to my first premise in a very important way, where abstraction was also very, very important. My fourth premise is one that you probably are familiar with, the idea that crafts and what are sometimes called the decorative arts in European tradition are in fact what art is. It's considered all of these objects like ceramics, woodwork, metalware, portable objects, furniture, are all considered having full art status, and great masterpieces were created in these kind of in the realm of everyday objects. So painting and sculpture are important in Islamic art, and we have examples of both, but they're certainly not in some type of hierarchy where those are considered the better or more important or significant forms of art, whereas this humble bowl created in earthenware in the 10th century in Iran is not. So everyday objects have full art status in Islamic art and were often treated to really spectacular forms of ornament and decoration. Fifth, the idea that writing has high status in Islam. This is probably also very familiar to this particular audience. And calligraphy is, of course, a major art form. Writing is significant decoration for buildings and objects, and its elevation to a high art form already was in place by about the 10th century. We see, for example, that buildings use ornamental calligraphy as a major feature of architectural ornament that unifies spaces, which were not always necessarily meant to be read in kind of a textual sense, but rather to communicate knowledge, learning, and also the simple and powerful beauty of the Arabic characters themselves. Tied to the idea of writing is, of course, the importance of the arts of the book. So manuscript painting, illumination, and decoration are also major art forms. This is a theme that I'm sure comes as no surprise to those of you listening as well. But of course, great masterpieces of illumination, an art form that is still very much alive today in London, in fact, is a major center for that as well. But also we see, of course, that objects of manuscripts also had a kind of tradition of figural ornamentation that was instructional in nature too. So, for example, these diagrams of automata or little robots that were kind of like pouring your wine or kind of doing different things for you were wonders of the ancient world and then also wonders of the medieval world in which Islamic art flourished. And we see these types of objects are illustrated as well, but also, poetry and different other forms of the literary arts always had accompanying artistic traditions that valued the pictorial arts. And this was all arts of the book. So manuscripts were conceived of as complete objects that had, from the binding and the gilding of the leather on the outside of the object to the interior paintings, the illumination, and of course the calligraphy were all the work of many hundreds of people to create spectacular masterpieces with which we are all familiar. So books, manuscript painting, illumination, and decoration are major art forms. And lastly, the idea that geometry and patterns are an extremely complex, highly developed, and sophisticated merger, really, of mathematics and art. This is here in the beautiful New Arts of the Islamic World galleries here in Houston. Houston and Dallas, you may not be aware of this, have now the third largest collections of Islamic art in the United States. So if you ever come to visit, please let me know. I'll be glad to arrange a tour for you in our spectacular Islamic galleries, either in Houston or Dallas. We're very proud of them. And actually, Houston has the 5th largest population of Muslims in the country. So it's very fitting that we also have this wonderful collection there as well. So to close, I'd like to kind of bring us back to the beginning, to think a little bit, to ask a little bit about why we might want to study Islamic art. And I've got a few couple other examples that I'll just show you as I go through here. Why might we want to study Islamic art, and what this study of the past can tell us about who we are in the present? And particularly, I guess, more broadly, what does all of this have to do with the study of art history? It should be obvious by now that the study of Islam studies the traditional story of a kind of unified story of European ascendancy that moves directly from Greece to Rome to the Renaissance and to European global domination in the era of the Enlightenment and colonial rule. Yet the study of the complex past of Islam also troubles another key framing of European Enlightenment thought. Namely the idea of unified national identities that still trouble our world today. A deep understanding of the complexity of the Islamic world's past is also an understanding of the complexity of our present that was created out of that past, of the fact that just as in the past, in the present too, we cannot discern a simple, unified narrative for the unfolding of a single people through time. It's a narrative that our modern resurgence of racially and religious nationalism would like us to ignore for the simple binaries of in-groups and out-groups, a reality we're seeing today unfold around the world in many places. But in fact, if we wish to live together in this rapidly globalizing world, we would do well to embrace all of this complexity. Art, of course, can be deeply humanizing. It is among humanity's greatest achievements. But complexity is also humanizing, difficult as it may be to convey, to communicate, and to learn about. Doing so through the pages of an art history textbook, it would seem, is not a bad place to start, but only if we're willing to tell the tale of all of its rich, dense, entangled enmeshments, both past and present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mulder. I was really impressed with your insightful and incisive observations, and hopefully when this is uploaded to YouTube, I'll watch it one more time. Okay, so we're going to open the floor to questions to the participants. One participant, one question, please. Starting with Professor Paya. Please go ahead, Professor Paya. Professor Paya, you can go ahead. You need to unmute yourself, Professor Paya. We cannot hear you. You need to unmute yourself. Okay, till Professor Paya solves his problem, let's move on to another person.
You may be able to unmute him as the.
I'm not the host, unfortunately. The host is Brother Azhar. Can you unmute Professor Paya? Okay, let's move on to another person so we don't waste time. Any other questions, please?
Hi, can I ask a question while we're waiting?
Please go ahead. Please
Here's
go
Professor.
ahead.
Here's Professor Pius seems to have.
Professor Paya, have you resolved your issue?
Doesn't seem so. Shall I?
Okay,
shall I
go
just?
ahead. Go ahead, Narmina Lama.
Professor Mulder, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation and a really inspiring ending, kind of concluding remarks, which I really enjoyed a lot. And I've enjoyed your presentation, I must say. I have a lot of questions, and I really wish you were here live in London so that we could really take the discussion and I could ask you all these questions that I have. So perhaps I will ask a question around, I have two, but I will just ask one and then see how others, maybe someone else mentions it. So my question is around, you mentioned the use of abstraction as a means of conveying the essence. And I just wondered whether you actually had a chance to research deeper into what the actual purpose of this is, what the ultimate purpose is.
The purpose of the technique of abstraction.
So the purpose, because you said that was kind of unique to the Islamic art. So I was wondering. So my understanding was that this would perhaps be used to facilitate communication. And a kind of it would carry a potential for perhaps a personal transformation and so on. So I just wondered whether you researched into it, whether you have some thoughts around that. What would be the purpose ultimately of this? Is it for the sake of pleasure, or art for the sake of art, or is there kind of like another dimension that is perhaps beyond this? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for this really wonderful question. It's one of my favorite things to think about with respect to Islamic art. And you've put your finger on several really important questions with respect to abstraction. So the first thing that I just would like to say is that when I teach, I always have kind of like, I have to do a lot of work in the beginning of, the first class meeting with students, because whether I have a lot of Muslim students, I have a lot of not Muslim students, I've got like myself, a very diverse, sort of group of students here at the University of Texas, as you can imagine. And, but one of the things that I always try to get them to see, what I try to get them to do is really to unsee what they have been taught about what art is. And in some way, all of us, whether we want to be or not, are still kind of laboring under this assumption that naturalistic figuration is like normative, that it's normal, right? When in fact, European interest in that illusionistic mode of painting or sculptural representation is actually quite unusual in human history. In fact, very few other human cultures anywhere were as interested in that type of naturalism as Europe was. And Europe, it's one of its great achievements, certainly this idea of kind of, getting to replicate precisely what the eye sees, right? But one of the really fun stories I always like to tell students is that in the 15th century, 16th century, when there were the first Jesuit missionaries who made missions to China and who met some of the Mongol rulers, for example, or other Chinese rulers, they brought with them paintings as a means of saying, oh, look at our culture. We're so great. We can make these, illusionistic paintings that look like you're looking through a window onto a real world. Aren't we amazing, right? And as kind of evidence in the minds of the Jesuit missionaries, this was evidence of kind of the superiority of European culture. And of course, China, with its very ancient sense of its own superiority, these Chinese artists were entirely unimpressed by this. And they simply said, well, to represent something's external image is the simplest of tasks. Like, we master that within the first few years of learning how to draw and paint. What's really hard is to represent the inner essence of something, right? And that is the purpose of Chinese painting. And I think Islamic art was deeply influenced, certainly in its later iterations, but even before it comes in contact with East Asia, Islamic art is really interested and really explores this notion of the way that abstraction can bring out, the essence of something far more powerfully than a simplistic kind of, one-to-one representation of what the eye sees, right? So what do I mean by this? Okay, well, look, I have a blouse on by chance, I'll just use this, that has some abstract forms of, of what we'd probably identify as flowers or other types of images. Why would someone want to make something that looks like this? Well, it's because the abstraction of the form of a flower is of in itself pleasurable, right? It creates something which is interesting in a different way and which captures something about flowerness that is different than a simple one-to-one representation of a flower, right? And that interest in the way that abstraction can bring out, if you can exaggerate a part of something, for example, or if you can flatten something and put really pure, vibrant color on it, you actually look differently. You see different things than if you just simply kind of mindlessly replicate, what your eye sees photographically. So I guess my answer would be that it's not at all unique to Islamic art. In fact, Islamic art was participating in a broad global culture in which, visual culture, artistic culture often embraced abstraction. And in this way, Islamic art is much more like kind of part of the story of the human engagement with art than European art with its rather strange interest. I mean, strange but wonderful, but it is unique interest in kind of pure naturalistic representation, scientific representation for its own sake. So it's a bit of a long answer, but I guess I would say that interest in kind of the way that abstraction can pull out the inner essence of things is a real thread that runs through Islamic art and many, many other global artistic traditions as well.
Thank you. We'll go back to Professor Paya. Please go ahead, Professor Paya.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Mulder. I'm terribly sorry for that hiccup. I'm not very good with this text, but my colleagues helped me. I truly enjoyed your rich talk, but of course, you took us out of our zone of comfort. Art is not my forte, but as a philosopher, I think there is a parallel between what we were discussing and what is being discussed in other fields concerning Islamic things. One of the major topics is Islamic sciences. I'm sure you're familiar with that phrase. And the same sort of question which you ask about Islamic art could be asked, actually has been asked about Islamic science. What is Islamic science?
Right.
As for one, I have argued, and I guess I wonder whether you had time to go through those papers I sent to you. My argument is that science is just science. And if I want to draw a parallel between what you said with respect to art, I agree with you that art is art, universally adopted by all people. Actually, as you know better than me, Immanuel Kant would say that the sense of aesthetic is universal.
Mhm.
But when we come away from the notion of science or knowledge to the level of technology, and technologies are responding to our non-cognitive needs, or they facilitate our cognitive pursuit by acting as tools which would extend our senses.
Mhm.
Now, when it comes to technology, as far as art at the level of ideas are concerned, I entirely agree with you that there are universal notions which are shared by human beings, qua human beings. When it comes to technologies, as you know, again, better than me, are sensitive to contexts.
Mhm.
Because different environment would provide different material, you need to adapt yourself to what is available. And the environment forces you to choose skills which may not be applicable in other surroundings and environments.
Mhm.
Now, I have listed 3 uh, headings, of course, inspired by what you suggested, and I would want you to inspire us concerning the element of Islamic in these 3 headings, which I'm going to share with you. As a tool, I guess Islamic art would act as some sort of device to register and record events. So, for example, you showed us some pictures in which scientists were working or lovers were embracing and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
Now, again, as a tool, it serves the purpose of quenching our thirst for aesthetic values. And thirdly, and this is something which I would want you to comment on, as a tool, it will help us to represent our sublime ideas. Now, in these sublime ideas, there may be differences between, say, Christians and Muslims, Muslim and Christian both, and Buddhists.
Mhm.
Each one of us would regard those sublime ideas in a different sort of paradigmatic forms. Now, if I now put to you that with your vast knowledge in Islamic art, if you want to suggest the impact of context on the way Muslim artists express themselves, which element would you highlight? And before I let you enlighten us, let me just add this. Some people would suggest that a difference, perhaps apparent difference between Islamic and, say, Western art, especially Roman and Greek arts, was that the element of nudity was prevalent in the latter, whereas that element cannot be found in Islamic art. But correct me if I'm wrong. Please go ahead.
Nudity you can find nudity in Islamic art, but you're right that it's rare and it's unusual. I mean, there are many, you can think of many, images of, from Persian romantic poetry, for example, where, one might see, nude women, or in early Umayyad art in Syria, inside some of the early Umayyad palaces, there are also images of nude men and women. So it does exist, but it's usually in a pretty restricted princely context. It would have been like a small number of kind of learned friends who might look at these types of images. There are also what we would consider to be directly erotic images that form part of the corpus of Islamic art, some of which have survived from the Safavid and Ottoman period. They're not very well studied, but are increasingly becoming more well studied. So that's just that's a small side point just in your last comment, but to take the larger question about, thinking about art, first of all, I also just wanted to thank you for sending your really fascinating article, which I did enjoy reading quite a lot. And this framing of, whether or not we consider Islamic art as a kind of tool, right? Or all art as a kind of tool. I think it works very effectively, especially because maybe on 2 levels, because you often need actual physical tools to make Islamic art, whatever it may be, right? But also as a tool of communicating ideas, feelings, emotions, state of mind, etc. Art is extremely effective. I mean, that sort of trite little comment about a picture being worth 1,000 words, right, that we all know, it's just simply true, right? I mean, you see an image and you can instantaneously understand, what might take pages and pages of text to convey. So that, as a tool, art, I think, is a deeply, powerfully communicative and effective way to communicate ideas. The last part of your question, which was, or maybe kind of going backwards, it was in the middle, actually, the question of what distinguishes Islamic art from European art. I can't remember exactly how you framed it, but
Yeah, go ahead, please.
what I would say, I think that is very characteristic of Islamic, what you were talking about Islam, what makes this term Islamic, workable. I think what probably is the thing that really stands out is the fact that, and it's easy to forget this is why I always show that map. The vastness of Islamic empires meant that they were inherently cosmopolitan. They were inherently filled with tens of thousands of different types of people, languages, religions, ethnicities, etc., right? And we often forget how tiny Europe was. So like the biggest empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Austrian Habsburgs, whatever, they're like a third the size of just the modern nation state of Iran, right? I mean, they're so tiny, right? And when you're that small, you really don't have to, most of the people within your borders are going to be fairly homogeneous, right? Europe itself was fairly homogeneous. And so the idea that you had to have kind of like, a mechanism of encompassing all of this diversity and bringing it under one unifying umbrella so that people weren't constantly fighting all the time, that's a really important feature of all global empires, not just of Islam. So in Islam, that mechanism, of course, was the idea of Ahl al-Kitab, right? The people of the book. And if you belonged to this category, you were given a kind of protected, and you paid your tax, right? You were given a kind of protected status. And every big empire had some mechanism like that. For Rome, it was the idea of the citizen, right? So if you were, it didn't matter if you were black or white or what your religion was, it mattered whether you were a citizen or not a citizen. So these types of kind of big unifying characteristics are an essential part of any kind of imperial system. And Islam has its own iteration of those, right? And so what I would say is that all of this complexity, all of these peoples, these religions, these, kind of different ethnic groups, they all leave their mark in some way. And sometimes, we see this, for example, really nice example is that on the Sultan Hassan Mosque, one of the most famous works of medieval architecture in Cairo, there in Cairo, you see East Asian peony and lotus blossoms carved into the stone of this, mosque in Cairo. And the fact that that motif was deliberately chosen by the builder of this building, Sultan Hassan, in the middle of the 14th century, it tells you that he wanted to represent himself as being the ruler of an empire that had those types of global ambitions, that could encompass all of that difference confidently and comfortably. And I think that kind of big confidence, right, that you don't have to be threatened by difference because you're secure and confident in your, the borders of your empire. And you can then begin to kind of play around with and examine that difference in all kinds of ways through art and through literature and poetry. And as this really great comment in the chat from Mohammed Hossein also says, in philosophy, right, and in other realms as well. So yes, I absolutely, I hope that answers your question. Happy to answer a follow-up if I didn't quite get it.
Oh, no, many thanks. Thank you so much. It was truly enlightening. Thank you so much.
No, thank you also for sharing your wonderful work. Shall I just answer very briefly the question that it's related, actually, the question in the chat about philosophy that, of course, included figures, Jewish and Christian figures. In fact, they were very instrumental for the development of Islamic philosophy. Maimonides, Yahya ibn Adi, of course, among them. And the question that Mohammed raises, which is an excellent question, is whether this audience is probably familiar with Marshall Hodgson, the great scholar of Islamic history, who coined a term Islamicate, to refer to what he saw as the kind of secular, let's say, princely culture that was not specifically religious, right? So like maybe, images of lovers and others. Oh, I have a little dog in my lap now. Hello. Would be an example of this, that they're not specifically obviously religious in some way, but they are part of Islamic culture also. So I guess I would refer you to Shahab Ahmed's book, because Shahab Ahmed wrote his book specifically to reframe Hodgson's argument, because Hodgson basically said, okay, well, you have Islam, which is all of the legal scholars, the rulings, and the religious belief and faith and practices. And then you have all of this quote unquote secular princely culture, and those are two different things. And what Shahab Ahmed says in his book is that that's actually a very Eurocentric way of thinking about dividing things up between sacred and secular. No pre-modern human being anywhere would have had this notion. That's a European Enlightenment division, right, between sacred and secular. And his whole argument, Shahab Ahmed's argument, is that basically it was Islamic to include all of this contradiction and all of this diversity. That is what being Islamic meant, basically, was your ability to confidently encompass divergent arguments. I mean, Islam is like a great discursive sphere, right? There are multiple discourses. There's not one pope telling you what to think or believe, right? There are different legal rulings, different conceptual framings, it's as different as every single living Muslim in their practice of faith. And all of that complexity, Shahab Ahmed would argue, is what makes Islam Islamic. So he actually rejects Hodgson's notion and instead argues that we should think about this as being characteristically and inherently Islamic.
Well, thank you very much for replying to Mohammed Hussein's question. Ms. Mirzai.
Can I make a quick comment?
Please, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Actually, I agree with what you said earlier, that you talk about Islams rather than just Islam. That is a very acute way of referring to this complex phenomenon. The parallel is with, say, liberalisms, which suggests that there is just not one interpretation of liberalism. So I entirely agree with you that there are different types of understanding of Islam, and each of those approaches manifest itself in some different form of art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to Ms. Mirzai. Please unmute yourself, Ms. Mirzai, and ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much for your time and your lecture. Actually, because I missed some of your lecture, I'm not sure if I'm right or not, but as I understand is that, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, as I understand, you said that there was a kind of exchange art between European and Muslim and something from Europe and East and this kind of thing, which I'm not agree as an artist. I'm working I'm working as a freelance artist, traditional artist for many years. And when we are teaching, we always emphasize don't follow the rule of Europe, because, for example, in our painting, we have few elements we have to follow, the same as beauty, unity, and circle, while we don't have such a thing in European art. This is one thing, and I'm quite agree with you when you said that it's not just about the art of Muslim. Of course, before Islam, we have advanced art in Iran, and at that time, they weren't Muslim. So definitely the art which they carry on after Islam is a part of Zoroastrian as well. So it's not just Islamic art, it's a kind of, it's better to call Muslim art rather than Islamic art. So if you, and the other thing is that when you show some image that like some ruler drink a wine in this pot, for example, which is quite different with the rule of Islam, I have to say that we have this kind of stuff again, because we make it before Islam, but it doesn't mean that people drink wine in this kind of pot. Maybe the name is used for the wine, but in the reality, they never drink, not never, but most of the time it's not using for the wine. And having said that, wine has different kind of drink as well. It's not just a wine you take you to, in some word which doesn't, move you to another word. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm waiting for the answer. Thank you very much.
Can we clarify what Ms. Mirzai meant by saying that perhaps there are other types of drinks in the Muslim world that are not necessarily alcoholic? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
I mean, I know that it seems strange, but I think it's one of those essential contradictions. The sources on wine drinking are voluminous. So we know that wine was drunk, and that in fact within Sufism it came to be argued by many Sufi practitioners that it was a path to God. I mean, that was really the image that I showed you, which is allegory of worldly and otherworldly drunkenness, shows a group of Sufis who are drinking. So I know it's like a bit uncomfortable to make this argument today, but as a historian, I mean, I know it's not religiously a pious argument to make, but as a historian, the evidence for wine drinking is abundant. It's everywhere in poetry and records of both ordinary people and princely culture. The drinking of alcohol was not unusual, and it also is important to it's also important to recognize that there were always people who thought it was wrong, right? So my argument was really not that, like, Islam was never just one thing. There were many people who were pious Muslims who felt that wine drinking maybe was a little bit of a bad thing, but not the worst thing you could ever do. Then there were people who really felt that wine drinking should never be done, right? And who really criticized those who drank wine. And then there were people who thought that drinking wine could be a path to God through Sufi practice. So all of this contradiction and complexity, exactly what Shihab Ahmed would argue, is what makes Islam. It's the fact that Islam could encompass all of these divergent discourses, even about something as simple as wine drinking. Today, of course, we're in a little bit more a moment where I think it's more normal not to drink Islam as a Muslim, right? But in the past, that certainly was not the case. We have a lot of historical evidence for that. I'd be happy to point you to some sources.
Yeah, but sorry, we are talking about the artists. We are not talking about the people who use these tools. We are talking about the artists, and artists, when they make it, it doesn't mean that necessarily they make it for drinking wine or whatever. They just creating art.
Yeah, we have also a lot of historical sources, chronicles, histories, poetry. There's quite abundant evidence for how common it was for people to drink wine and other alcoholic beverages.
Sorry, one more thing is that because my other question is still there, which is the difference between Muslim art and European art. Is a huge gap, actually, big difference between these two art, which I told you about the beauty, unity, and circle, which we have in Islamic art. But apart from that, I'm going to mention about, again, wine. When you're talking about wine, we believe that an artist is someone who is living in another world and actually bring us some news from the world which other people actually doesn't access to that world. And when they are going to bring this one, they have to be in alam khiyal, alam khiyal. And normally, when we are going to bring it in a poem, it should be some word for it. And the word for this one is wine. It means that now this person is living in another world. So if you see this word in many of the poem, I think the meaning is that this person now is in another world, not specifically talking about, as my friend said, that like alcoholic thing, which make your health in a different issue. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, I mean, the point that you make would have been a totally valid discursive argument that many pre-modern Muslims and many Muslims today would make as well, that this was a metaphor. In other words, that real people weren't drinking wine, and that wine just became a major, metaphorical symbol for other states of mind, as you point out, alam al-khayal, or alam al-ghayb, or all of these different kinds of ideas that we gain from Sufism. So that certainly could well have been the case, but equally well, we seem to have absolutely direct evidence for, it couldn't be that in, 1,400 years of history, we have abundant references to real people drinking wine, and every single one of them was wrong. So as a historian, like as a pious Muslim, I can understand why that idea would be disturbing. But as a historian, I have to just look at the evidence in front of me. And it seems clear that while sometimes it was metaphorical, wine drinking actually did truly happen. And
of course it's happened. I just wanted to say that this word in the poem normally means alam khiyal. As a Persian, because as a Persian artist and a Persian who speak Farsi, so we use this one instead of alam khiyal. And yeah, absolutely, you are right. Thank you very much. Yeah, I do understand that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Mirzai. We don't have much time. We don't have much time. Hello. We don't have much time left. We just have space for one more question.
Sorry, Dr. Narmin has asked a question on the comments. Could you please read this for our lecturer?
Dr. Narmin, you can maybe summarize your question because it's quite long.
I know. I didn't want to be rude and take anybody else's time. So if somebody else has a question, I just thought I'll sneak it in and see what happens.
Well, let's see if we have missed somebody. Massey probably has a question. Would you like to ask your question, Massey?
No, it wasn't a question. It was just to follow up the conversation was going on.
All right.
We just additional comments. Yes.
All right. Let's move on to Narmina as the last questioner. Please go ahead.
So maybe I will just quickly summarize it rather than. So my question is to do with this concept of mathematics that you mentioned also earlier. The idea that actually at the core foundation of all the arts lies this concept of rhythm and mathematics. And this is something that is kind of really shared from a traditional point of view. It's something that is a kind of a common expression for all of the traditional sciences. I hope you will agree.
Yes.
For example, the Greek concepts of harmony of spheres and so on. So for Muslims, maybe this comes a bit more naturally because they're daily immersed in this kind of rhythmical character of Quran recitations and and so on. So I was wondering, seeing that these kind of rhythmical patterns are usually linked with the harmony and human and social order, as well as the cosmic or universal order. So this is kind of a law of correspondences, as above, so below. So I was wondering, from a comparison point of view, when you look at the modern art, why do you think there is this strong insistence by the modern artists to break these rules of harmony and to really kind of go against it, to sort of strive for example, in the works of Dali and Picasso, in the modern architecture as well, Saudi smart city, one line city, and so on. It kind of goes against these conventions of what's harmonious and what's beautiful. So I was just wondering whether you had thoughts on this.
I mean, this is an amazing question. Thank you so much for this. All the questions have been so great today, so I really appreciate it. So I guess I would say, I was trying to think whether I agree with the final, the whole first part, completely accurate. I think that's absolutely the case. And I think that it's one of those things that's not completely unique to Islam. So for example, African art, whether it's Islamic or not Islamic, African art is deeply interested in rhythm, and visual rhythm is a really important feature of art. So I don't think it's entirely unknown. But I guess what I would say is that, I mean, there is modern art. Modern art is a vast sphere itself. And by modern, I think you mean kind of at first European art, but then modern art becomes a global phenomenon, right? So there are modern artists working in all over the Middle East as well that
Absolutely,
are
yes. Yes.
right.
Yeah.
So I think that modern art, I mean, the purpose of modern art was to actually critique and break from those European conventions of particularly painting, right? And sculpture and architecture as well. And but I don't know if I would agree that it was always breaking with harmonious compositions and rhythm. I would say that sometimes it is, and sometimes it's actually making an emphasis on rhythm and movement. So think about, like, you know, Nude Descending a Staircase or some other types of works of art that try to capture, like, you know, the rhythm of a human body's movement through space on a two-dimensional canvas. And so I think that modern art sometimes does break with those traditional kind of what we would think of as harmonious, you know, mathematically kind of controlled rules of harmony and proportion and so forth. And then sometimes it really leans into them and explores them. I don't think it's necessarily an either or when it comes to modern art. When it's trying to break those conventions, it's doing that because it's critiquing traditional European arts, desire, like what modern art really, like if you think about, like, you know, modern art is interested in self-expression in many cases, right? So there's this notion that, like, the individual artist is a human soul with a distinct worldview. It's very much kind of arise out of European epistemologies that frame the individual as kind of the center of things, right? And so, and the idea that art is the artistic expression of an individual mind, right, means that modern art is pretty infinite. It's not kind of, it's not easy to categorize as one or the other. So I don't think I think I probably opened up more complexity because it's such a great question. But maybe it gave you something to think about a little bit.
But isn't it the function of modern art to actually shock the viewer or the person who comes into contact with that?
Sometimes that was
Yeah,
its purpose. I
think
mean,
that's
there
the
was this
main function.
idea, and there was this idea of the shock of the new. So another kind of modern art shifts the relationship between the individual and the idea of originality and authenticity changes profoundly with modern art.
Yeah.
So in other words, that you know, the purpose of the art was to create something that had never been seen before. And that idea of originality is baked into our contemporary notion of art. And that would have been completely alien to any artistic practitioner anywhere in the world in pre-modern times, where replication of past models was a really important way of learning how to make art and what people conceived art as, actually. So this idea that a work of art had to be completely original and overturn everything that came before, that's totally alien to most pre-modern, you know, ways of thinking about art.
The pre-modern model of art usually depended on patronage, which
Yeah, that
probably doesn't exist. It exists sometimes if you have
Yeah.
Saatchi who is going to buy the unmade bed.
right.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, thank you all for coming. First of all, I would like to thank the Professor Stephennie Mulder